Well, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm sure that you are just brimming with the inspiration that comes from all of the good information that you have been receiving this morning and from conversations that you've been a part of. I had an opportunity to drop in on the keynote and was really moved by what it was that I was hearing, not only what I was hearing from the keynote speaker, but also the commentary, the conversation, the chat, and the feedback too as well. So, welcome, and my name is Jackie St. Louis, and I will be your host, helping to facilitate this conversation between two wonderful people who I will just allow to step in and introduce themselves.
You first, Leonie.
Uh, Hi, I got thrown off because I saw a friend of mine show up. But welcome, everybody. My name is Leonie Smith, and I'm really glad to be here. I'm joining you today from East Point Peace Academy, which is dedicated to supporting nonviolence training. And I'm so looking forward to stepping into this conversation. My purpose is really around supporting all people, but especially Black, Indigenous people of color, to be able to show up in their full humanity. And so I'm looking forward to exploring that and the theme of grace in our time together. Thank you.
And hello, everyone. My name is Sean Goode. Most important things is I'm married to the most amazing human in the world. And I have two incredible teenage children, 19 and 14. And I steward a nonprofit called Choose 180 as our executive director, where we work to transform systems of injustice and support the young people who are impacted by them. And at the core of our cause is a conviction that grace is the greatest motivator for behavior change, and it will always far exceed that which guilt can accomplish. And that in the midst of leading with grace, it gives birth to unlimited possibilities and removes the stigmatization that a problem can present. And so I'm grateful to be a part of this conversation today and to be in space with these two brilliant-minded folks, and honored that 41 of you opted in so far. So if you got other friends, like, go send them a DM real quick, let them know this is the group to be in. We get the number up to 50, maybe 60, right? Like, whoever many people want to join, and tap in and enjoy this adventure.
All right. Thank you, Leonie. Thank you, Sean. And to those who haven't heard my voice prior to this, good morning. To those who are just coming in, welcome. And we have some anticipated outcomes. We have some goals for what we expect to happen today. But nonetheless, when Sean, Leonie, and myself, when we met, we said that we're going to allow for the conversation to take us where, what we feel led. But we do hope that folks can leave today with a better understanding of restorative justice and transformative justice, but also to reflect on ideas and principles of grace, healing, relationship, and community too as well. So with that stated, and maybe allow for Sean to start because he introduced the concept of grace. I want to ask Sean or Leonie, can you share a reflection on what grace means to you and how you may have been served by grace in your own life?
I'm happy to start with that. So for me, what grace means to me is, for me, it's really focused on this idea of humanity and being able to step in and fully understand and represent my own and invite the humanity of others, people to show up in terms of vulnerable expression and vulnerable being. And the way that it's shown up or has plays a role in my life is that probably the most significant space has been in the work that I have done and continue to do around supporting my own decolonization and stepping towards my own liberation and supporting spaces that help others to do so as well. There's something that has come to me in that work around being able to step into an understanding of myself that isn't from the orientation of white supremacy or the white gaze. And what that means is that it's a beautiful opportunity to be able to discover oneself without the weight or the burden of that holding. And also to be able to, the grace part has allowed me to be able to mourn the gap that has existed, the years, the decades spent living with that orientation, and the opportunities for connection that were lost. And so that's what it means for me to step into my own humanity and where grace lives in my particular being.
Thank you, Leonie.
Jackie, can you ask the question again? I got lost in Leonie's answer.
Absolutely. Most definitely, Sean. And he asking that if you could share a reflection on what grace means to you, what it means to you personally, and how you may have been served by grace in your own life.
Yeah. As I mentioned in my introduction, I believe that grace is the single most transformative gift that we can give. And that upon receiving grace, an unapologetic grace, an unencumbered grace, it leaves so much room for the imagined to occur. It's liberating, and it's also scary. It's freeing, and it feels restrictive. And yet I've not encountered in my existence anything that's as powerful. My personal faith journey ties me to grace as a method of redemption, and forgiveness, and an understanding that no matter how much I've done in my life that's been contrary to my best self, things that I've done in my life that have been not in line with the original design and purpose of my being, that there's forgiveness there, and a forgiveness that only increases as my shortcomings increase, and experiencing that type of grace through that faith context, but furthermore, experiencing it in the love that I received from my wife, which was the first time that grace was truly introduced to me in the physical form, to be able to journey with somebody who knows you in the most intimate of ways and still sees you as though none of those past wrongs even matter or even relevant as you begin to journey forward and with one another. And being introduced to that grace through that love, for me, liberated and a compulsion to be able to offer the same to any and everyone that I've had the chance to be in space with. But it's complicated, it's difficult, it's weighty, and so necessary all at the same time.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Sean. And I think what I hear from both of you guys, and correct me if I'm wrong, I almost hear that grace requires a certain amount of vulnerability.
Yeah, absolutely. Grace is a laying bare, and in order to be able to give it, you have to be able to give of yourself and of your true and most authentic self. So absolutely, there's a transparency, a vulnerability that's required in order for grace to carry the impact that it's created to provide.
Thank you, Sean. Following up on the concept of grace, why is grace so relevant in the current time in which we live?
Do you want to start us off this time, Sean? I'll follow you.
Yeah. This is funny. Only I smirk because of the conversation that Jackie and Leonie and I had the other day, and we live in an era where folks get canceled really quick. If you disagree with something or someone, instead of sitting in the tension of that disagreement and finding common ground, we're quick to cancel and say, well, you're out of here. Like, no, you're wrong. You're wrong. You're done. You're canceled. You're out. And as quick and convenient as canceling someone can be on the front end, on the back end, we lose so much when we fail to find a way to journey together. And there's something transformative about the collective us coming together in spite of our differences and reconciling in our common spaces and finding a way to travel towards a more just place. And in that is where you find grace, because grace is the only way that you can possibly accomplish that. And I think it's one of the misconceptions around grace sometimes is that you can apply it like a salve when there's a wound, but grace selectively applied is favoritism. And so if Jackie harms me and I don't walk in grace, and then Leonie harms me and I walk in grace, then I'm not operating in a space of grace at all. I'm operating in a space of favoritism. And that's not, then I become, the moment that I other the other, I become the other, and then I'm just as guilty of wielding favoritism as dominant culture wields favoritism, and it's and that's deeply problematic. And so in this cancel culture that we continue to find ourselves immersed in, I think grace is like the glaring red exit sign that allows us to walk out of this narrative of either or and find a way to journey together in our shared humanity.
Some really good stuff here, Sean. Thank you. Leonie?
Yeah, there's so much there that I want to lift up, but I'll add that, excuse me, that for me, grace is an avenue to humility, and which opens up space for curiosity and connection, which for me leads to the what is the natural state of how we are meant to be as human beings that has been lost through the impact of systems of oppression, which is around interdependence. So for me, grace allows for us to get to a place of recognizing how much we rely on each other in order to move things forward and to survive. You know, there's so much, because we are all living under and with systems of oppression. One of the impacts of that is that it buries understanding, because so much doesn't get to be seen or heard or said or understood. And so for me, what grace gives is that space and room to name the things that don't get said, to name the ghosts that are in the room, so that they can be considered and part of how it is that we understand what's needed to move things forward. So we're moving beyond just kind of surface relationships and actually looking at questions like, where does ancestral harm come into this? Where do ancestral gifts come into this conversation? You know, how am I being impacted by particular systems of oppression? You know, how can I make room for the conversation that I might have impacts, for example, of white supremacy culture, but that also the white identified people in the room have impacts of white supremacy culture? And is there a space for us to talk about those impacts, and would having that conversation lead to better understanding and ability to move forward? So that's for me how it shows up.
I want to ask a follow-up to you guys, Leonie and Sean. You know, I think something that's often missed is grace turned inward, right? You know, you think about, you know, people of African descent, indigenous folks who have, you know, lived these experiences that can be extremely difficult. And then there's grace that we're extending outward. But what does it look like? Can you guys just shed some light on what it looks like to extend grace to oneself? Because I think we often miss that piece.
Mm-hmm. That's been a really integral part of especially the work that I've done for my own self around this idea of liberation and understanding the impacts of colonization, is that when we turn grace towards ourselves, we can support ourselves in having a sense of tenderness, understanding, and acceptance. And the ways that we can do that is by actually making room for mourning. For mourning the gap between what is and what we would like to be. And so for me, I do particular practices. For some people, it's like meditation, etc. My thing that I have found really helpful is that one of the things that I do is around looking at principles of nonviolence and nonviolent communication. I use the self-empathy process within nonviolent communication as a decolonization tool for myself. And it allows me to have a sense of tenderness for the gap, to mourn the gap between my understanding of myself now and the one that I carried with me for most of my life, in which I saw myself in a more diminished capacity and as a diminished entity. And so for me, that is one of the ways that I'm always wanting to support myself, to have some sense of tenderness and acceptance of myself, so that I can tap into what it means to be me, absent the lenses that that may be put upon me and that dehumanize me.
I'm just sitting with that for a moment, Leonie. I often don't think about what it means to give grace to myself. I do think about what it means to allow myself to be vulnerable enough to receive grace from others. I believe in this reciprocal action that anything you put out, you inevitably end up receiving back in return. And I've found that in my life, I've been most challenged at receiving grace, and willing to give, willing to pour, willing to operate and walk that out, but very much so challenged at receiving it from others and allowing myself to be fallible and make mistakes and find myself in the company of those that see beyond those mistakes to still see me as fully human. And I believe that that is the greater challenge. And one of the places where we suffer the most is that it requires a vulnerability to be able to receive as much as it requires a vulnerability to give. And that receiving of grace creates an interdependence upon our shared humanity that then requires me to be in relationship with Leonie and me to be in relationship with Jackie. And as we're in our shared humanity with one another, in community with each other, if I'm not able to give myself grace because I'm a deliverer of grace, then if I'm going to receive grace, then I have to be in authentic relationship with others who give grace, which then means I'm bound together with the people who I'm journeying with, because as we travel, whatever this thing is that we're doing together, we're inextricably tied in need to be able to be vulnerable. But to be vulnerable means we have to be present with each other in our vulnerability. And that's, in my mind, the way that I think about this idea of giving grace and giving grace to oneself, that it's less of what I'm giving to me and more what I'm allowing myself to be open to receive from others in an effort to be an authentic community as we journey together.
Thank you to you both. Some really good stuff here. And we have a question that I thought I would take now. The question is from Gwendolyn, and the question is, must grace have a religious connotation, or whether it can exist outside of that sphere?
As somebody who was, who served as a minister and still finds myself preaching in a Christian context on occasion, I absolutely think grace exists out of a spiritual context. The principle of grace is transferable. Now, the strength that you carry in order to operate in that grace may have a faith context behind it. It could, a spiritual context behind it. It could be drawing strength from your ancestors. It could be drawing strength from your theology. It could be drawing strength from your shared relationships. I just say from my personal experience, it takes a lot of resilience to walk in grace, and a resiliency that I've never found within myself absent of a contribution of a greater power. But the principle of grace is transferable in any context, absent of any religious, spiritual, or faith-based connotation. It's just too often only spoken about in faith-based in context. And if we brought it into the mainstream more often, I feel like we live a more liberated way of being and vulnerable way of being around each other outside of the bounds of a building.
And I resonate with so much of what it is that you're sharing there, Sean. And the only thing that I would add to this is that the actually a piece that I want to lift up in what you name is the importance of community and grace, that it cannot exist without community. That even if you are drawing from a faith, based source, that community is where it lives. I had the experience of growing up in an organized religion, and I would say that grace was not something that was very present in it because I did not have community. So for me, that is the regardless of what the source is, how it gets maintained is through community, through a sense of connection.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you to you both. As we transition to speaking about the work of restorative justice and movement building activities, How can grace take us out of dominant white supremacist culture of doing things? For example, domination, oppression, punishment, those sorts of things. How can grace show up in the work of restorative justice and movement building activities to take us out of that white dominant culture way of thinking and doing things?
Okay, I'll take a crack at this one first then. Um, there is so much that grace can do in these spaces, because I think the first thing is, I'll say this. So what tends to happen is when we come together as communities and as movements is that we rely too heavily rather, on the shared passion that we all have, as though it is enough to keep us in connection and to keep us motivated. But taking that on as a framework, and only that as a framework, is not robust enough or resilient enough to actually allow us to be able to be effective both in addressing the issues around that particular passion and also in holding care. It doesn't show us how to hold care for each other. And so what tends to happen in movement spaces is that disconnection can happen, and it could be quite severe, but disconnections of all types and kind of grades and levels can happen because there isn't space given to, one, admit that we are working from dominant systems, white supremacist systems, to admit that those are things that are shaping the choices that we are making, and shape our understanding of what standard behavior is, what the rules are, what the ground rules are, that type of thing. And so what grace can allow us to do is to welcome conversation and action around how we are going to manage the habituated oppressive ways that are in us when we are together, coming together as communities and in movements. So how are you going to manage things in terms of, for example, the impact of patriarchy? How are you going to manage things in terms of the impact of racism, which might show up as bias? It might show up in many different ways. How are you going to have, even, for example, conversations when conflict comes up? Like, can your group make commitments about, one, being willing to engage in conflict, which is counter narrative to the way that we are typically engaging in conflict, which is that certainly in a Western context, we don't engage with conflict. We try to ignore it until it becomes a crisis. So to be really deliberate in addressing those pieces that, again, allow for more of the expression of full humanity and will give us the pathway for how to stay connected while we are coming together in community and in movements.
Leonie, I feel like I kind of want to sign off and just be on the sidelines listening to you share. Man, you speak to my heart in such a wonderful way, and I'm honored by the lens that you're bringing into this conversation. And I'm grateful that it may be like this panel situation that's brought us together in this way, but I'm excited for where the journey might take us. You are a gift. I say yes to everything that Leonie just said, and I hesitate to add anything to it because it was so full. It's kind of like sitting down at a table and you brought something from your house and you look and you realize that it wasn't a potluck and you're like, oh well, I guess you don't want my mom's fruit salad, but you really don't, because she used to put Miracle Whip in it, and like who really does that? I know, right? Like, that's what happens. White mom, black dad. I digress. And there's grace for that though. And yeah, I think one thing you said so powerfully that just resonates with me, and Jack, you just put it in the chat. We do rely too heavily on shared passions, right? Like that's where we come together. Like we're enthusiastic, we're excited, and then the energy wanes, right? And then we have conflict, and then we forget that being Black isn't a monolith, right? And that we have a diversity of perspectives, views, life experiences, identities that we're all bringing into the shared space. And because we're bringing it in, we're going to have dissenting opinions and differing approaches to be able to accomplish a similar goal. And grace allows us to still cohere in those moments when otherwise we would fall apart. And too often our movements fall apart because we just refuse to understand our differences and not criminalize our differences, not stigmatize our differences, but understand. And in understanding, still move forward. White dominant culture so often wants to prop one up against the other and create like this your story versus my story, your way versus my way, the right way versus the wrong way. And it puts us in this perpetual circle of and trap where we don't actually live into the journey that's set before us, and we stay stagnant, feeling active, but actively running in a circle. And I believe grace breaks the cycle because it allows us to still journey in spite of our differences. And our differences are so many. You know, like even the conversation around grace. And as an organization, we partner well with folks who are from dominant culture and work in systems of oppression to help to transform the way those systems function. And that's not popular. Yet we find that it's our way of operating in the space to change the way that things function. And it requires so much to do so, and an unapologetic conviction that, like, on the other side of this role as a human being, on the other side of the system of oppression are people, and they're people who may be operating within this system, but the people are not the system. And that if we're able to get to the hearts of those people by way of this path of grace, that any type of transformation could be possible. So that's what I can add. But Leonie, thank you so much for what it is you brought.
Absolutely. And I want to follow up to, one of the things you mentioned, Leonie, was that what tends to happen in movement spaces is that disconnection can happen and that it can be very severe. And simultaneously, you talked about how reluctant we are to engage in conflicts. I wanted to ask you and Sean, where does that reluctance come from? In your experience, why are folks so reluctant to engage?
I'm trying to speak from personal experience here. I won't even put on the scholarly approach or the deep theological idea around this. Look, being super light skinned as a multiracial Black man, right? Like, I have struggled through a good portion of my life of validating my Blackness, right, and wanting to prove that I'm Black enough, right? So if I have a dissenting opinion with someone else who I respect that presents differently than I do, and I want to earn their affection, I want to earn their acceptance, I want to be welcomed into that space, then I can find myself being backing away from conflict because I so desperately want to be welcomed in as part of, right? And I have struggled with that through so much of my life because there is a calling to be a part of, but then a feeling that I may not be welcomed in unless I prove that I can be woke enough, unless I prove I can be Black enough, unless I prove that I can be with the movement enough, unless I can show by my labor, right, that I can do what it is that anybody else can do. And it's toxic, and it's harmful. And I know that I've internalized that at different moments of my life and found myself going on journeys that weren't made for me because I so desperately wanted to be connected to something that I thought embodied the Blackness that I needed to be accepted by in order to validate who I am in the space. So I know the question you asked, Jackie, was a broader question, but it also spoke to a really a wounded person inside of me that's been on this healing journey of knowing that I'm good enough, right? And that I don't need to prove an effort to be a part. But I think so much of that conflict comes from this desire to prove you're the smartest, to prove that you're the wokest, to prove that you have the best plan, that you have the best agenda, that you have the best way. And at the end of the day, all of those are variable and none of them are concrete. And we are at our best when we're sharing our best selves, not our best actions, our best humanity, not our best activity, right? We are at our best when we're centering who we are and not what we do. But too often when we get into movement building conversations, what we center first is what we're able to do and how do we activate the doing before we actually get grounded in who we are in this thing that we're joining together to co-labor towards.
Really powerful stuff. Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, very powerful. So much resonates again. Um, and so it's like the thing with like conflict avoidance is that, especially from like what you've just shared, Sean, is that it comes from a place often. Sorry, it's important that we're tender towards that tendency to avoid conflict. Like it's not a thing that's wrong. It comes from a source. There's a reason why we do it. And the piece that I heard you name, and you use different words for it, but it really is around belonging. And as human beings, belonging is probably the most important need. We will do anything to belong. Many violent acts have happened around belonging, right? And so there is that sense of, you use the word desperate, it is a sense of desperation. So it feels like that if we were to engage in conflict, it feels like it's a threat to our belonging with that person, with that group. And so we often choose a strategy of not saying anything. And so therefore, in terms of our being, we disappear. We're now in a space where, because we don't feel that we can actually express ourselves with some sense of authenticity, we've taken a relationship that may have started with passion, a lot of shared awareness, shared understanding, and we've turned it into something that's transactional now because we're afraid to show up. And often because groups are not designed around supporting people and being able to show up in ways that are outside of what white supremacist culture prescribes as being the standard or normal behavior. So oftentimes we avoid conflict because there isn't enough resource in the room to deal with the conflict. There is a sense of, like I said, a threat of not having belonging. And so what we are in need of in those moments is to have a pathway to both hold the impact of whatever the conflict is, and also to stay connected to what our shared purpose is. But that's many groups, many people wouldn't know where to even start on how to step towards that co-holding of those two pieces. And so this is one of those areas that we can focus on when we come together in movement spaces, is, are we addressing not only the sense of belonging or the emotional kind of toil, but also finding a way to link it back to the shared purpose, so that way groups don't become entangled completely by conflict. They find ways of being able to hold it and to stay focused on the movements that are necessary now, considering that we're in a time of severe climate impact and looking at the impacts of racial justice. This is a really key time for us to be in a space where we're staying active in those movements and not locked down by conflict.
Yeah, and Leonie, one more thing I just want to add is that, like, time and resources are often the things that put us into conflict, right? Because how often are we convening in movement building spaces with time constrictions? And how often are we coming together because there's like a battle for resources that are like time sensitive? And so when it comes to creating the space for us to authentically connect around who we are, it's like, okay, that's good, but we got to get done with this work, right? But like the real work that we continue to not do is that collective healing work, that if we did that intentionally on the front end because we desired it, not because like white folks are calling us together in a work group to find a way to distribute resources throughout our community, if we gathered together because we needed it, not because there was some money that was on the table that like brought us together for this particular purpose, but if we just came together for some healing because it was what was best for our collective soul, man, I imagine a future of how much more we'd be able to accomplish when called upon to do those other things, because we wouldn't have to start over all the time. And I find myself constantly in a new space, hitting the reset button, asking like, how long is it going to take for us to see our shared humanity so we can build something real, instead of all these sandcastles with the knowing that the tide is rising at any moment.
Really powerful stuff. I want to take some time now to get you guys to respond to two questions we have. The first being from Elizabeth, and it's, how do you shape conversations so that people feel free to point out when the oppressive and habitual systems are creeping into our conversation? So I think right on cue. How do you shape conversations so that people feel free to point out when the oppressive and habitual systems are creeping into our conversations?
I would ask, how do we create the space so people feel free? Shaping conversations for me always feels like I'm guiding something to get to a particular end. And I feel like what often keeps people from pointing out the oppressive and habitual systems is the safe space that we have or haven't created that allows for conversations like that to happen. And if the space isn't safe and folks don't feel protected, then they're hesitant to point out any type of oppression for a variety of different reasons. So I think it's like that's that intentional building of space and the culture that centers whatever the gathering is, like the values that are driving that conversation are the things that liberate authenticity, in my opinion.
Yeah, so true. And one of the ways that strategies that I have used to support the creation of such spaces is that early in your time in coming together as a group, or you could do this at any time, is to do a round of asking the question, if I do something in which you feel diminished or I have created harm, here are some ways that that would support me in learning from, in being able to connect with you in those moments. I really would appreciate it if, something like along the lines of, I'd have a hard time if it was addressed completely in the group, but I'd be happy to do like a one-on-one conversation to hear about the impact that I've created and hold accountability to the group. Or for us as individuals to think for ourselves, if I'm a person that has done or created harm in this group, what am I willing, what can I tell the group to support them in supporting me being able to hear the hard to hear message? Say, for example, if I've done a microaggression. So to actually think about what would work for you. And the reason why that's important is because part of where the struggle comes when we're having these conversations where things have gone wrong is that it's never just about the conversation, right? It triggers other things. And you know best what your triggers are. So if it's the kind of thing where, so like for me, one of the things that I have is that if somebody has an issue with me, say about something that I'm supposed to do related to work, because of my experience of bullying as a child, I shut down if that happens in front of a large group. So what I tell people is, that I want to hear what's up for you in terms of if I've disappointed you or not done a piece of work or whatever. And the best way for me to hear that is that you let me know directly, that you come to me. You can send it to me by email. Like I get specific about, so people can see themselves doing the behavior. And that's because I want to be able to hear what's happening for that person. And I want to be able to hear it knowing that I have things that I find triggering. So to actually give yourselves, do a round, like ask people in the group, what is the best way for me to approach you if you do something that I feel has created harm for myself or for others? And have them tell you. Like that's a simple strategy that we can do that would open up the space for more conversation when there's conflict or things don't go in the way that we would like.
Really powerful stuff. And I think what's coming up for me as I listen to you guys is that, grace requires vulnerability, and that requires trust, and that requires relationship, time, and reciprocity. And going back to Sean's earlier point, when there's resources and outcomes that are in play, how much time do we actually have to, or are we willing to commit to investing and building those relationships from which we can have, that grace, reciprocity, that trust as well. We have another question, and this one is from Blishta. Hi, Blishta. And it is, what do we see as some impacts of our cancel culture, specifically for BIPOC folks? And what are some things that we can do to move away from this? So the question is the impacts of cancel culture, especially for people who are BIPOC, and what are some things that we can do to move away from cancel culture?
So I love this question. For me, when cancel culture when it comes up, what tends to have the impact is that it stops the conversation. So whatever it is that you're exploring together, that whole conversation stops. Now, usually that conversation is an important conversation. And so what I always recommend is that And I think that this is especially true if you want to like label yourself like anti-racist or any of those things. When you're in communication with somebody and there is impact, you stop everything and attend to the impact first. It's what you do. Somebody in this moment has received harm. And so moving forward with your agenda without acknowledging that harm means that you are not showing any care for the impact. So the invitation is that within cancer culture, like this idea of canceling, what happens is there's an impact and then there isn't enough resource in the room. And so you're wanting to have resource to both be able to address the impact and attend to the conversation or the work that you're doing. So find a way to address the impact. It could look something along the lines of, you know, I've been impacted by the thing that so-and-so has said. And I need 3 minutes of silence just to check in with my body and see how that is. Or if someone is witnessing an impact, I'm seeing that impact has been created in this moment. I would like to take a pause, whatever, for 5 minutes or 10 minutes and caucus. But to find a way to address the impact, to bring just a little bit more resource so that the group can continue in its conversation. And it can be just enough connection and care for the person to receive it as connection and care. And you can make other plans for it to support the situation that's happening outside the room, but then the group is also able to move forward with its conversation or with its exploration, knowing that the person who's been impacted has received a care and that they've received care and that they've said, this is enough for now, or this is what I need for now. So that is one way that I think canceling shuts things down, is that it moves us, it stops the movement and conversations from moving forward. I'll pause there. Thank you.
It also doesn't allow us to heal and get beyond our woundedness to a place of authentic presence with each other. It also puts us in a position to recreate the same systems of oppression that we're looking to be liberated from by virtue of operating in the same way. You know, it's if we liberate ourselves from white dominant culture and then we create another culture dominated by ideals that then oppress white people, where do we end up at? Is victory becoming the plantation owner and enslaving those that oppressed us? It may feel great in that moment and it may feel redemptive, but ultimately we end up losing our souls to the same hate, angst, and dehumanization that our ancestors suffered from.
Yeah, some really powerful stuff there, Sean. Yeah. I feel like a footnote, is victory becoming the plantation owner, something to think about, something to resonate on. I want to take another question here we have from Jen, and that is, grace for ourselves and for our allies in this work is hard enough and the necessary place to start. But how can we use grace for those who actively support racist systems and practices? And this with 7 minutes left, but I want to have you guys respond to that. How can we use grace for those who actively support racist systems and practices?
Okay, succinctly answering this one, Jackie, I'm going to do my earnest. So I served as a chaplain in juvenile detention for about a decade and sat with young people who were accused of doing some very egregious things. And they were children. They were children who at times made really horrible mistakes that people felt like they deserved long sentences locked up in buildings with cages as a result of this poor choice that this adolescent child made, because they felt like they were beyond redemption. If I believe that young person isn't beyond redemption, then I have to believe that all people are not beyond redemption, and that all people are being constrained in their redemption due to the environmental conditions that are producing whatever toxicity is pouring out of them. The young people that I sat with in that context that had at times done egregious things, grew up in a context where that thing that they did seemed like the most logical choice in that particular moment based on the situation that was surrounding them. All of us have grown up in situations and circumstances and environments that have shaped our worldview, and the shape of our worldview often we pour out of, and when it's toxic, it harms people intentionally and unintentionally. So at the core of my being, I have to believe that all people are able to live into redemption, not just those who I find myself most uniquely aligned with because our narratives and our stories sound similar, or because I grew up with or had experiences that align with them, but all people. And if all people can be redeemed, then we hold out hope through grace for that redemption to occur. Now, that doesn't mean that I emotionally connect myself to people who cause harm, but it does mean for me that I'm always keeping the door open for a conversation to continue to get to a place where redemption occurs. And as we work with prosecutors and law enforcement and school superintendents and a variety of people who uphold systems that cause harm, we've watched over the long run them begin to do things differently, to begin to institute policies and divest from themselves and invest in community. And it doesn't show up with the type of expediency that we'd hope for, but it's happening. And the hope is that when things aren't quickly happening and it takes a long time for them to occur, that it's genuine and that it's sincere and it's not just a knee-jerk reaction. I also will say that grace is a multi-generational plan, that grace is not the most succinct way to get to an outcome or to a result, that grace is a hope that transcends my life and perfectly transcends the life of my children into my grandchildren, that one day, by virtue of grace, that we will see a world sustained that's more just because of a commitment to walking it out in this manner. So those are the things that resonate for me when I think about the difficulty of grace and pertaining to those that actively support racist systems and practices.
Thank you, Sean. Leonie?
For me, this is an area that, this is kind of like right in my wheelhouse because it is a difficult thing to do. It's a lot easier to kind of just like put people in their place, like if they've done or said something racist or oppressive. And yet the invitation for this idea of grace is an important one, because one of the ways that we can hold it for those who it seems like are actively involved in doing racist acts or engaging in oppression. One of the things that I find helpful is to remember the fact that we are in systems, that we are in systems of oppression that are designed to not be seen by those who hold most power. So people can be engaged in behavior without awareness. So one of the very first things that we can do is to bring awareness to the situation, because this is the question that happens around, like, I don't want to be educating white folks about racism, for example. But the truth is that in systems of oppression, white folks it's designed for white folks not to see the impact of what it is that they are doing. So one of the ways that we can address it with grace is that we can choose not to step towards the education piece, but we could also choose to name exactly where the harm has been done, so that you can at least mark for yourself and acknowledge for yourself that harm has happened. This is a way to do, there are different ways, because there's another piece that I saw here in the chat around, basically that canceling people who do racist acts is a way to kind of have safety and protection. And I would agree. The difference is with this idea of grace, or as I would hold it as with nonviolence, is that there's a way of being able to do that hold most care for the humanity of all people involved. So including for the person who has done the act. And that's where restoration comes in. That's where transformation comes in. That there are ways of being able to step towards protecting ourselves, naming the harm that has happened, and doing so in a way that recognizes that we're still dealing with another human being, even if it's a human being that has caused harm for us. So that's the invitation for us to try and to recall in those moments.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Leonie. I want to, we have like 1 minute left. If you have any questions, you want to put them in the chat, but I want to just hold space, Leonie and Sean, for you guys to just maybe offer some final sentiments.
I would, I guess I'd offer that anytime there's a conversation around grace, by virtue of it being grace, there's no period. This isn't one of those conversations that end and there's this feeling of liberty that may live immediately on the other side. Often grace causes confusion. Often grace causes a disruption, and it's intended to do so. Grace requires sitting in a space of tension. And so as you leave this and you may be struggling with some of these concepts or these ideals or the fact that, or the notion of all people being able to be redeemed, I would ask you to have the grace to sit in that tension and to be patient with what it is you're experiencing long enough to see if you can discover the humanity of those that you may vehemently disagree with, because it's in those moments where we can see a glimmer of humanity, even in some of the darkest of moments, that we can discover what's always truly been there, the essence of someone's being.
What a beautiful thought. And the thing that I would like to share in closing is that stepping into living with grace, is counter narrative to what is expected of us. It's not how we are habituated to be. And so therefore, I want to name how moved I am to see that we have a group of 55 people who have joined us, and invite you to think about, where do you have community to support you to stay in a place where grace can be at the forefront, and how it is that you relate to yourself and to others. That it's essential to have community, because you are existing in a way that is counter narrative to the way that the culture would like you to exist. So I invite you to think about and to reflect about whether or not you have sufficient community and what it would take to build it for yourself.
And I want to thank everyone who has been here with us today for your questions, your comments, to those who are just silently listening and taking things in. Leonie and Sean, I too am excited for where our journey will take us. And I know for me, this has had, personal resonance, and it's given me a lot to think on too as well, and started a process of healing that I think has been very necessary. So thank you so much for sharing of your time and wisdom.
Thank you. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, everybody.